Welcome. Thank you for being here. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, that we are on treaty lands, treaties that have been signed on our behalf, and so we are signatories to those treaties and responsible for implementing those treaties. We are also on lands that are subject to treaties that have been signed among the Indigenous people. Specifically here, the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and it's a significant treaty, a peace treaty that was signed by multiple Indigenous nations. The Dish with One Spoon is quite significant. It refers to the lands that we're on, that there is only one dish, and there is only one spoon, and that we need to share and make sure that when we partake of the dish, there is still something left for the next person. And in addition, the second rule that is significant to that is that we need to keep the dish clean. And that's something that settlers in particular, I think, need to understand, because we haven't done very well on that. We have tonight with us two excellent speakers. We're very honored to have Chris Black and Atif Kubursi, and I'm going to do a brief introduction of them. A couple of housekeeping matters first. The washrooms are out the door and to the right. There is water over here and some cups if you find the need. We will have each speaker speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for questions afterwards. And I've been asked by photographer Henry if anyone has an objection to having their photograph taken. If you indicate so, he will not do that. Okay, thank you very much. I think that's the things that I was supposed to be doing at the beginning here. So let me introduce, I'm going to introduce both speakers now rather than jump up and interrupt things. We're going to begin with Chris Black and then go to Atif Kubursi. So Chris is a Hamiltonian, attended high school in Hamilton, wasn't born here, was born in the UK, graduated from McMaster in psychology and got his law degree from Osgoode Hall, majoring in international law. For the first decade after he had that degree, he was mainly engaged in civil and administrative litigation, and then became a criminal lawyer, initially with Charles Roach in Toronto, and then on his own, defending the accused on all criminal code offenses, including several notable murder cases. Since 2000, he has been an international criminal lawyer, practicing before the international criminal tribunals, including cases respecting Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And currently, he's on the list of defense counsel at the International Criminal Court. He was chair of the International Legal Committee for the defense of Serbian President Milosevic and worked on other Yugoslavian cases. He also defended the chief of staff of the Rwandan National Police, who was acquitted on all 60 counts of genocide and war crimes in 2014, the judges finding that the charges had been politically motivated. Chris is a member of the Law Society of Ontario, the International Criminal Court Bar Association, the National Lawyers Guild in the United States, the American Association of Jurists, and he writes for various journals on legal and political issues. So we're very honored to have him here as a speaker. The second speaker who will follow him, Professor Atif Kubursi, is an emeritus professor of economics at McMaster. He holds a master's and doctorate from Purdue University in the United States. He taught at Purdue, was a visiting scholar at Cambridge, a fellow of the Institute for Social and Economic Policy at Harvard, and an adjunct professor with the School of Environmental Studies at York University. He served as the acting executive secretary and the undersecretary general of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. He has consulted regularly with multiple United Nations and international organizations and governments, and continues to do so. He has authored a dozen books and over 2,500 papers in academic and professional journals, including technical reports. The book titles include The Economic Consequences of the Camp David Accords, on oil industrialization and development in Arab Gulf states, food and water security in the Arab world, which was done for the World Bank, cooperation and development in the energy sector, and input-output analysis of fiscal policy in Ontario, which was done for the Ontario Economic Council. Atif is the founder and president of Econometric Research Limited and sits on a number of community and academic boards, including Trans-Arab Research Centre, Canadian Arab Federation, Wellwood, Raising a Village, and the Canadian Journal of Development Studies. And he's an active member of Democracy Probe International, which is one of the co-sponsors here tonight. The other organizing co-sponsor, the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. So I would like to invite Chris to come up and begin our evening, and Atif to simply throw him off the stage at appropriate time, and you'll go from there.
There's a lot to be said about the issue we're embarking on, and I could spend a day or more talking about the complex issues involved. But to keep it fairly simple, I'm going to talk about three things: a brief history of Korea, and my experience in our visit to Korea in 2003, which has been echoed by Eva Bartlett and other people who visited North Korea since, and the legalities of what they call sanctions being imposed on North Korea and why they're both illegal and immoral. I'll start off by talking briefly about our trip. In 2003, I was invited by American lawyers of the National Lawyers Guild to take part in a trip to North Korea. They had been invited by the Democratic Lawyers Association of North Korea. Yes, there are lawyers in North Korea, and there are criminal defense lawyers in North Korea, believe it or not. And so that's who hosted us, and that's who invited us. And we went there through Beijing, and what we saw was a complete surprise, because it was not like anything they told you or tell you about in the media here. It was completely the opposite. So we came away with the distinct impression that the better and more civilized a country is, the more it's demonized and the bigger the lies placed against it. But to understand why those lies are put out to convince you that North Korea is a terrible place run by a terrible government, terrible, evil people, why they want you to feel that way about North Koreans, you have to look at their history. And history goes back a long time, 5,000 years. Korea is a very ancient culture. It has a very close and sometimes hostile relationship with China. The Chinese influence is very heavy. And it had a small series of kingdoms and emperors from the 15th century up until the early or late 19th century. After the Russian-Japanese War in 1905, Korea was occupied by the Japanese Imperial Army. And by 1910, the Japanese had completely taken control of the entire society, so that they appointed the governors, they appointed the administrative officials, they banned Korean. In Korea, you had to speak Japanese. No newspapers could publish in Korean, had to use Japanese. There's rumors that they murdered the last empress. It was not clear, but it looks like that's what happened. And from 1910 on, Korea was used by the Japanese as a base to attack East Manchuria and eastern China, and which led to the wars in China in the 1930s and then the war with the United States in the 1940s. So Korea has been under occupation by the Japanese up until 1945, summer of 1945. And since then, Korea has been occupied, the south of the country has been occupied by the Americans until now. So we have a country which has been under foreign occupation for over a century. Actually, a century and a half. And that's what has led to the conditions we now see. In 1945, at the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Red Army advanced into North Korea with the assistance of Korean communist guerrillas who were fighting with them against the Japanese all that time. And the Americans advanced into South Korea, or the southern part of Korea. The Japanese Imperial Army refused to surrender to the Soviet Army, instead surrendered to the American Army. The Americans preferred that, the Japanese Imperial Army seemed to prefer that, and in fact the Americans kept the Japanese Imperial Armed Forces in place for several years after they took over to help them administer and control the population. In fact, anyway, after the Red Army advanced into the north, there was an agreement at Yalta and other places that Korea be allowed to have its own independence and to establish its own government of its choice. Most of the people seemed to be in favor of the communist and the socialist regime. In fact, when in 1946-47, when I think 300,000 or 400,000 Koreans living in Japan were allowed to leave Japan, almost 95% of them chose to go to the north, not to the south. And that's where their loyalties lay. The strength of the communists across the country was very strong, and the communists set up certain parties, workers' parties, under various names between 1945 up to 1950. I won't go through the long, complicated changes of the names of the parties and the different socialist parties which existed, and their interactions is quite complex. But it was quite clear that socialist parties were very popular across the entire country. In 1947 or so, the puppet regime that the Americans set up in the South began suppressing the communists and socialists in the South. And there was a rebellion, I think in 1947 or so, in which it's estimated 100 to 350,000 people were killed in 1 year by the American forces and Syngman Rhee's Republic of Korea forces. Communist cells were suppressed as much as possible, and so many communists fled to the north. People sympathetic to the north went there, and the communists in the south went underground. During that time, a lot of skirmishing was going on between the north and the southern forces up until 1950. In 1950, there were several big raids, cross-border raids by both sides, but the biggest raid was in June 25th. Republic of Korea forces, we believe, with Japanese Imperial Army forces and American forces attacked the north, and the north retaliated and ended up conquering Seoul, which resulted in the Americans sending in massive forces to counterattack. That's being described in history as an attack by North Korea on the south. It is used all the time to justify expressed fears of North Korea, that North Korea attacked the south. It did not. When we were in North Korea, in the museum there, in the War Museum, they have captured documents which the communist forces captured when they overran the American Army headquarters and the American embassy in Seoul. They captured those documents intact. And we were shown those documents, and we were 5 lawyers, and 2 of us were criminal lawyers, the rest all civil litigation lawyers. We know a forged document when we see one. Our conclusion was that they were legitimate and authentic. Those documents indicated that the Americans had planned the attack on North Korea with the Republic of Korea's South forces, with the help of Japanese Imperial Army officers. So it was the United States and the South Republic of Korea which attacked the North, and that's when the war began. In that war, as you know, or many of you know, it's estimated 1.5 to 3.5 million Koreans were killed. We saw places in Sinchon where the Americans committed atrocities you would not even believe or imagine that could happen. And And I won't tell you now unless you ask me, but they're very horrible. And so there's a lot of fear in North Korea that the Americans will repeat that exercise and want to conquer North Korea, not just to take over North Korea for its minerals and to crush an industrial power, but to also use it as a base to attack China. So, since 1945, 1950, Korea has been divided artificially by the demilitarized zone, and North Koreans do not recognize that zone as anything official. They do not recognize the government of South Korea as a legitimate government. They regard it as a puppet government, an occupation government. And many South Koreans we met in Pyongyang, we spoke to, regard the government of South Korea in the same way. North Korea has come back from the devastation of the American attack, which leveled the country. Pyongyang, if you visit Pyongyang and have the chance to go there, is a beautiful, in fact, futuristic city. It's really something to see. It's clean, modern, open, wide open boulevards, parks everywhere, brand new buildings, some quite futuristic in style. But you'll never see there any old buildings, not one, because the Americans leveled every building in Pyongyang. It's estimated they dropped more bombs on North Korea than were dropped on all of Europe in World War II. More bombs than they dropped on North Vietnam, and in a shorter time frame. And that's what North Korea now fears, and why it's developed its defensive system of nuclear weapons, because it fears that without them, they will be attacked. When we went there, we met with officials who told us that their position has been consistent all the way through for the last 25 years, 30 years, that if the Americans demilitarize South Korea, if they agree to a non-aggression pact against North Korea, if they sign a peace treaty, they are willing to abandon their nuclear weapons. They told us that the nuclear weapons defense systems drained a lot of their resources, spent a lot of their money, and use a lot of their talent. And they prefer to put that talent and those resources to better use. But they feel they have no choice. They have limited manpower to put into the army for defense. Most of the people want to do other things. And so they feel they have no other choice but to develop a weapon system which the Americans will respect. That is, a weapon system that will hurt the Americans if they attack. So the position we're in today is that, once again, Donald Trump, like the other presidents before him, are threatening North Korea with all sorts of devastation, unless the North Koreans basically disarm. And if the North Koreans disarm, they fear they will be attacked. The North Korean position has been consistent since the early 1990s that we will abandon our nuclear weapons if you agree to these things. Their position is the same today. There was a meeting in Helsinki today, in Finland. There was South Koreans, North Koreans, and Americans met in Helsinki today to discuss the meeting coming up with President Kim and President Trump, probably in Sweden, but maybe in Helsinki. It doesn't look to me like there's much room for movement. It's very good that they're talking, but the Koreans are not going to change their position. They will not abandon their nuclear weapons systems unless the Americans give them a non-aggression pact and a peace treaty, and unless they withdraw their troops. Because as long as the American occupation forces are there, they are a threat against North Korea. The Americans will not budge unless Donald Trump said yesterday, I'm going to meet them, but I'm not going to meet them unless they take concrete steps before I meet them. That is, they start to abandon their nuclear weapons. So I don't see any room for movement. But I'm hopeful that the talks will maybe bring some reality to the American president's head, and he realizes that they can't get anywhere unless they do something else. But we've had Americans promise things before. Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter in the 1989 through 1995 period, when Soviet Union collapsed and was replaced by the Russian Federation, a capitalist state, Russia withdrew its oil supplies to Korea, which created a great hardship. The Americans, and they began using nuclear power to fuel their electricity and so on. The Americans claimed that was going to be used for nuclear weapons and put embargoes on North Korea. That was withdrawn, or promised to be withdrawn, if the Koreans agreed not to develop nuclear weapons and to abandon their own nuclear power units. They agreed to do that and to take light reactors, which could not be used to develop weapon systems, in return for America supplying oil to generate electricity and so on. The Americans reneged on that. The North Koreans actually dismantled their nuclear power plants and so on, but no oil came. So the Koreans started up their nuclear power plants again and withdrew in 2003 from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. At that time in 2003, North Korean officials went to see Governor Bill Richardson in Arizona, who was acting as a go-between between the Koreans and Bill Clinton. And at that time, the Americans said they were willing, perhaps, to give them a non-aggression pact and a peace treaty, which is more closer to the North Korean position than they are now. But nothing ever happened. So the Koreans, when I was there in 2003, they said they had weapons that could reach the United States then. Anyway, we're now 15 years down the road, and they seem to really have them. So it's a very dangerous situation in which the Americans are threatening to attack constantly. They've moved B-2 bombers there. They've moved entire fleets there of cruise missiles and ships, which are basically on a hair's trigger and can launch an attack at any time. I spoke to a soldier at the DMZ, a Major Kim, who told us that he was actually a poet and wanted to be a journalist. But he joined the Army because he said, I have no other choice because I fear they're going to attack us, and if they attack, I'll be dead in the first second because they're going to hit this place first. I'll be dead, I know that. I won't survive the first attack. But my brothers are in the Army, my sisters are in the Army, because we feel we have to be in the Army. It's because what they did to my mother and my father and my grandparents, you would not believe. And they're not going to do it again. So the fear is palpable and real. The Americans are dancing through hoops to try and convince the world that it's an evil regime. It's not. That it's a dangerous regime. It is not. It threatens no one. And that leads me into the issue of the legality of these sanctions that they're imposing on North Korea, because I have to finish quickly. The sanctions which are being imposed by the Security Council are actually outside the jurisdiction of the Security Council. They are based on a resolution adopted by the Security Council in 2016. No, 2006, I believe it was, the first one, in which the Security Council stated that they were sanctioning Korea because it had withdrawn from, was trying to withdraw from, and was violating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That is not true. The Koreans had the right to withdraw, and they withdrew completely in 2003. They started to withdraw in 1993 and suspended their withdrawal, but they then activated it in 2003. So they're not bound by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty any more than any other country is. And they have the right to develop nuclear weapons, the same weapons that every member of the Security Council has. And like the United States has, and the United States has thousands, as we know, and has actually used them on Japanese cities, and threatens to use them constantly. The new nuclear policy review issued by the United States about a couple of months ago states that they now feel they have the right to attack and use with nuclear weapons anytime they see fit in any scenario where they feel they need it. It's no longer a situation where we're only going to use nuclear weapons if we are attacked with nuclear weapons. Now they're saying that we will use nuclear weapons anytime that we feel it necessary to protect our interests, which means, and they have a first strike policy, that is, we will attack first. So that's what the North Koreans face. Now, the propaganda against North Korea is absolutely fierce in the West. They're telling you all sorts of stories about people starving and people being mistreated and so on. That's not what we saw. That's not what anybody I know has been there has seen. The first people we met when we arrived at our hotel in Pyongyang were American Army officers, if you can believe that. We walked into our hotel and there was a bar in the hotel. I went to the bar and there was a big guy, muscles and baseball cap, a couple of black guys, a couple of white guys in t-shirts. They looked like Americans. So I asked them where they were from. They said, we're Americans. Where are you from? I told them where we were from. And they revealed that they were American Army officers. And that's the first day I arrived in Pyongyang. This hermit kingdom, they say, this place which is shut down, nobody can get into. The first people we meet in our hotel were American Army officers. They turned out to be a remains recovery team from Hawaii who had been in the country for 2 years to recover the remains of American servicemen killed in the war. And they said, we asked them, this is our first day here, what's it like? They said, look, we were told when we left Hawaii that this was hell on earth. But everything they told us is a lie. Don't quote me, but this place is a really nice country. Everybody's well off here. The people are friendly to us here. We can roam around anywhere. They had a radio, a two-way, shortwave radio set up in the hotel. And they were sending signals back and forth to their headquarters without any interruption. They said they'd been over the entire country. There were no labor camps. There were no death camps. There was nothing like that. People were not starving. I had the chance to meet with some of the high officials in a private meeting. They pulled me aside and they told me that they did have trouble in 1995 and 1999 after 2 typhoons hit the country and almost destroyed the agricultural system and the electrical system, dams, irrigation systems, and that they were still trying to recover from that. And we did see dams and irrigation systems which were still being repaired. They said we were in deep trouble at that point, but nobody ever starved here. We take care of our people. Everybody is considered important. And you have to remember that the way they regard people is very different than how we regard people here. Every person is considered important, every child is considered to be important, and everybody is supported and helped. There's no death penalty. The longest time you can get in prison is 12 years, even for first-degree murder, because they don't regard the punishment attitude that we have here as helpful or conducive to a civilized society. They figure that if somebody does something wrong, it's got to be a problem with how that person was raised, or a problem that they've inflicted on that person. There's something gone wrong with the system. There's an element of they concentrate on rehabilitation and make an example of somebody, but throwing somebody in prison to them is just a waste of a human life. They can't understand what we do here. I understand now they reinstored the death penalty for treason cases, which still exists in Canada and the United States, by the way. They do not have the death penalty otherwise. So all these stories you're hearing about labor camps and work camps and death camps is all bull. And Pyongyang is like any other city in the world. There are children playing in parks, there are people going about their business, there are cafes and restaurants, and people look well dressed. If you look at the villages and towns, it reminds you of southern Greece, of Portugal, of Spain. Red tile roofs, stucco, white stucco cottages. The apartment buildings are quite modern. Housing is free, education is free, healthcare is free, and better than here. And university students, PhD students are paid a stipend and guaranteed a job after they graduate. The sense of life there, revolutionary spirit, is something I didn't even experience in Cuba. If you've been to Cuba, you know what it's like. The sense of excitement being there, the sense of what the possibilities that could be, that humanity can produce better things than we have. And in North Korea, you really feel that. When we left 2 weeks after we got there, we spoke to people who had been coming in on the same plane we came in on, Congolese diplomats, businessmen from Scotland, from Germany, because there are many people coming into North Korea. There was a farmer from Saskatchewan who was coming in, financed by the Saskatchewan government to set up a dairy farm in North Korea to help them train on how to use electric equipment. There's a lot of stuff going on. And yet we're told you can't go there, but you can. But when we left, we were sad to leave, and the Americans I were with are much more conservative than I am. Even they were sad to leave, because nothing you've been told is true. Anyway, I've only got 5 minutes left, and I can talk for about 3 more hours, but just, so to take away from my talk, the sanctions against North Korea are A, illegal, and why China and Russia are going along with those sanctions is beyond me. They have to explain that, I cannot. I can only assume that China and Russia agree to these sanctions in the Security Council because they're aware of some serious threat if they don't. It must be for some strategic reason, and I'm hoping that's the reason, because otherwise it's a betrayal. But knowing the Russians and the Chinese, I suspect there's something else they know that we don't know. But in any event, the sanctions are not legal, and no country in the world is bound by them, because they're, in law they're ultra vires, they're outside the jurisdiction of the Security Council. So no other country in the world has to obey them legally, but they will because of the American pressure. Secondly, North Korea only wants to defend itself. The people of North Korea do not want war, do not want to attack anybody. They just want peace. They want to be able to develop their own way, be left alone. And they want the Americans gone. And they want the threat gone. And lastly, North Korea is one of the most civilized countries I've ever been in. The Congolese diplomats we met said they were shocked. They said, we came in here believing everything we read in the newspapers in the West about how bad this place is. And we come out convinced that if Africans could see how the people live here, they would think it would be paradise. In fact, I would tell you many people in this room, if they went there, would think it would be paradise compared to what's in this country. Because the health care is better, the education is better, standard of living is better. But I'll leave you with one last anecdote. I had a driver. I was taken to a meeting with some high-up officials, and on the way back, my driver, who spoke pretty good English, asked me if you want to go to a cafe. I said, sure. So we went to this cafe, and we were sitting there, he was chain smoking, and he said, Mr. Black, is my government lying to me, or is it true that in your country you have to pay for a place to live? I said, yeah, it's true. He just shook his head. He said, well, that's diabolical. We don't even treat animals like that. Why would you have to pay for a place to live? Isn't that a human right? I said, yes. Well, what happens if you don't pay? I said, well, you get thrown out on the street. He said, that's inhuman. I mean, why do you accept that? I said, that's just the way the system is in the West. He says, oh, I thought they were lying to me. I couldn't believe such stories. I said, well, it's true. I think I'll stay here. So that's the kind of attitude. I mean, people need to know these things. That Korean people are really, we had an experience in the park, I got to cut out now. But we went up for a walk in one of the parks, and people talk about Korean starving and so on. In the parks, we saw people having picnics. We walked by one group, and they called out to us with our interpreter and asked who we were, and we told them Canadians and Americans. And they sent over a basket of clams that we could eat. Another group asked us over and stuffed apples in our pockets. Then another group came over and said they wanted to sing songs. And we all had to sing a song, because that's a tradition there. If you meet somebody, you're supposed to sing a song. So we tried to sing our protest songs we remember from when we were kids. Nobody sings anymore. But we tried to sing some protest songs with them, and they all sang along, and they were stuffing chocolates, and some had bottles of wine. And that was just a normal day in the park. That wasn't, and people when I came back said, oh, they must have set that up. You know, they must have rolled out those actors and rolled out those things for you and then rolled them back up when you went away. Well, that's how deep the propaganda is. That's not what we saw. People live normal lives there, they're normal people, they just want to get on with their lives, they don't want all this trouble. So, my message is that what the Canadian government is doing and with the American government and the rest of the NATO governments in threatening North Korea with basically genocide is to threaten the mass extermination of a beautiful country and a beautiful people. And people in this country should be aware that if they don't do something and protest these actions of their own government, that may take place. And then the Canadian people will be responsible. Those that didn't speak up will be equally responsible as those that pulled the trigger. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, and we'll have an opportunity to have both Chris and Atif answering questions after Atif speaks. And I should mention that if you have to leave early, there is a donation box on the table at the back. We will be asking for donations to cover the costs of the room and putting on this event. But otherwise, we're happy that it's free to everybody who can come in. Atif?
I'm delighted, and it's a great pleasure to be with you this evening and to share the podium with such a distinguished and incisive presentation. I'd like to begin by correcting the record a little bit because my friend Don had been so generous in his introduction. He gave me the honor of publishing 2,500 papers. They're only 250, and that is a bit of an exaggeration because actually I blame my mother for writing my CV. Let me begin by saying that the most interesting thing about sanctions is that they have never worked. They have failed and failed miserably. They are part of the modern landscape. They started really way back, but they became a cornerstone of diplomacy and political discourse. The most notable two are that of Rhodesia and South Africa in the 60s. But there were very little by way of sanctions up until the 1990s. 1990s saw more than 500 sanctions applied. And this number continued to grow. And the reason is that in the past, particularly when the Soviet Union in the era of the Cold War, there was no chance of bringing in any sanctions, particularly by the United Nations, because the two superpowers who were vying for influence and for managing the world never accepted each other's sanctions. If the Soviet Union were to impose sanctions or wanted to impose sanctions on a party, the Americans and the Western allies did not go with, and they exercised their veto power. The opposite exactly happened. When the Americans and the West wanted to impose sanctions on a unfriendly country, the Russians, the Soviet Union at that time, or the Chinese vetoed it. The story is totally different now. It seems like a large number of these sanctions have come about. And we have many types. There are what you call all-embracing comprehensive sanctions. The type that they had imposed on Iraq, the type they impose on Haiti, and the one they're now applying to North Korea. And there are the selective ones that they impose on each other or on friendly nations, but they are of short duration and typically very restricted and targeting a very particular action. They are unilateral in the sense the United States is known for being the one that has imposed more sanctions than any other nation, or multilateral when you persuade a large number of countries to act in concert. But this theory of these sanctions is predicated on a rational model, that you have a rational actor and they're engaging in unacceptable behavior, however you define unacceptable, and let's call this state X. And then you apply sanctions on state X, the presumption being is going to create disutility, it's going to create pain, and that this country would now have to weigh the pain that is really being imposed on it by the sanctions against the benefit it gets from being able to freely act or to exercise this unacceptable behavior. But if this cost is larger than that benefit, then the country would comply. The record shows that very few countries have complied. If there is any notable and defining characteristic about these sanctions, is that they have failed to persuade countries upon which or whom has been applied the sanctions to behave in the way that those who sanctioned them wanted them to. Actually, 3 guys looked at the record and found that there is compliance only in 34% of the cases. And then there is another guy called Pape. He looked at it and he says, it only succeeded in 4%. And then the United Nations examined the whole slew of these sanctions and said it's only 2%. Now what explains the difference? Well, those who looked and said the 34% had included in the database where they examined the compliance and non-compliance, every single sanction, whether it was unilateral or multilateral, whether it was targeted and limited or comprehensive. And that's why they came with a much larger rate of success and compliance. But those who took the major ones found that 4% is also an exaggeration. Now, the story that is quite telling here would be to look at what really explains success or failure. And the theory is very simple. Those who looked at it said, okay, you want to impose sanctions, they have a much higher likelihood of success if they were multilateral. And they are most likely to succeed if they are long-term and can exact and impose major losses on the party that has to survive and experience the sanctions. Well, if you look at the record, it's exactly the opposite. If you have a multilateral regime of sanctions, there are too many states there. They all have different interests and levels of commitment. Some are weak, some are diversified, some are close, some are far, some are engaged, some are unengaged. The greater the number of countries involved, the more difficult it is to uphold that regime, and there are much higher probability of failure. Lots of states that are neighboring to the country upon which the sanctions have been applied have every reason and every incentive to engage in less restrictions on the other country. They typically would bear more costs. They would not be able to sell as many exports. They would not be able to keep and cordon and isolate the borders. These borders are typically porous and they're not likely. I remember I was in Beirut when the Israelis imposed in 1982 a major embargo on everything coming to West Beirut. Actually, what came out is that West Beirut had much more fruits and vegetables, and that they literally have suffered in East Beirut because the prices in West Beirut went really up high and attracted every farmer to dump their products in West Beirut and denied it to the people in East Beirut. I mean, those who imposed the sanctions, and they call it economic sanctions, they're anything but economic or rational, because the economics works exactly in the opposite direction. And the evidence is very clear on this one. The other aspect is that the longer it takes, the greater the chance that the country or state upon which the sanctions have been imposed is able to adapt, to rearrange its events, its orders, its economy, and find ways in which they would make up for whatever they lost. Today, a glaring example of the failure of the sanctions to exact the toll that they had expected is Iran. They cordoned Iran and prevented it from receiving any products or technology. Today, Iran is far better economy, a more diversified one that is capable to produce most of the products that they had denied it. Today, Iran produces cars, produces planes, produces electronics, things they would have never dreamed because they were exactly like all other oil-producing countries, including Canada, who use oil as a crutch rather than being able to create the industrial prowess and possibilities. The other story that is very crucial, and this is the ethical argument. I mean, it's strange for an economist like me to talk about ethics, but it's about time that we really look at this other side. There's some economic value to it. One of the major consequences of these sanctions is they exact a heavy toll on innocent people. And there is no better example about this than Iraq. And I have really worked in Iraq and have gone, especially when I was in the UN, to assess what are the implications, what are the costs, what are the pains that these sanctions had imposed. I'm sure most of you know there are more than 500,000 children under the age of 5 that either died or suffered major malnutrition and diseases because of the sanctions. You must know that also that there were hundreds of thousands, some people estimated at least 263,000 people that died because of medicines that they could not fetch, because of malnutrition, they can't access the food. And by the way, there are some people, and what is Ken? He just mentioned the number to me, 2.6 million people apparently died after the problems of the sanctions in Iraq, because whatever we have now in Iraq, whether it's ISIS, Qaeda, or all the troubles, they came because the sanctions and the war had destabilized, had imploded that country. They lost $400 billion in terms of infrastructure, in terms of industry, in terms of capacities. Lost 4 million people who were engineers, doctors, professors, trades persons. Unbelievable amount of talents had left the country. Inflation during the sanctions grew at the rate of 1,000% per year. Whoever had any money saved, that was totally worthless and depreciated. They were unable to access any money sent to them from abroad because there were sanctions on their ability to access this money. And you all know about, there wasn't a bridge that was not bombed. There wasn't a hospital that was not bombed. Actually, there was a milk producing factory. It was bombed because milk goes to the army as it fights us and gives them prowess and calcium to stand and bones to stand in our way. I mean, the exact toll is continuing, and the sanctions continue to absorb and deplete resources and inflicts pain and suffering on very innocent people. So now they're saying, okay, well, we looked at all these sanctions and, you know, we should have known better. Well, I don't know how much they knew better. Actually, Madam Albright was asked one time, you know, 500,000 children under the age of 5 had died because of your war and your sanctions, and said, it's worth it. I don't know how could anybody with any brains or heart would come up to a conclusion like this. But the story that is quite interesting is that we are not learning from history. And what we're doing now to North Korea is exactly the same what we have done to Iraq. In North Korea, the Voice of Women for Peace and United Church had written to the committee that is entrusted by the UN to implement the resolution 1718, and they're saying, look, you should make some exemptions. You can't possibly target the civilians. You can't possibly target the weak, meek, and the weakest groups in society. In Iraq, the people who suffered most were children, women, and minorities. And what's happening now is that people in remote areas in North Korea are the people who are suffering most, because now there is no oil, they can't come. They can't, transport themselves or move their products. The people that are suffering most are those who are unable to access fertilizers and machinery and energy to plow their fields and to produce their food. The people that are suffering most are the weak and the people who are sick, who cannot access medication or the right balanced food. So if you're really talking about sanctions in order for states to comply, that what you're really getting, what you're really reaping is basically a major catastrophic experiences on the most innocent and most vulnerable of the people. So now we say, all right, we learned the lesson. I doubt it. They say now we have smart sanctions. We are going to avoid this massive, pervasive sanctions. We will have targeted, smart sanctions. The facts are they're anything but smart. And they have not been able to target the people they have designed to target and to hit. Oh, we're going now to target the leaders. So from now on, we'll freeze their assets. Yeah, I'm sure Kim Il-jong has money in New York. I'm sure Kim Il-jong now is not getting his favorite brandy. I was sure that Saddam never got all the fantastic cigars he wanted. I mean, what nonsense is this? That you are now going to impose sanctions that will only prevent the leaders from getting what they have. They are in power. I mean, this whole model is flawed because it's assumed, yeah, okay, we have a democratic system and the leaders. I wonder whether in democracy this works too, but okay, let's accept the illusion that's been created here. But the story is that the leaders always have access to things, whether it's in democracy or any other place. The people who cannot have access are those without power. The people who are unable to get to their medications and to their education or to the health services are not the leaders, but the poor people, the weakest and meekest in these societies. So the smart sanctions are not working either. Because if it's so smart and it's so targeted, and now, these people cannot drink their brandy, they're going to capitulate and they're going to basically denuclearize and they're going to comply and bow us. They have missed one fundamental truth, that countries have dignity. And there are people who really still cling to values and dignity. And these people are not going to capitulate. These people, on the contrary, will find the sanctions to be so humiliating that the reaction to these things is greater and more profound opposition to it. And that all the smart organization they're bringing about is anything than purely wishful thinking that did not materialize. There are lots of issues with these sanctions, other than just pure economics or even the ethical things. There are also questions of the foundation, the rational foundation, the theoretical basis of these things. As we said, it's predicated on a model of maximizing behavior of individuals or of society. But we all know, I mean, the economists think even pigeons maximize something, but no, the question is, it's not just maximization that's the only objective. There are so many issues, cultural things. One of the major mistakes is that we tend sometimes to think all people around the world think exactly alike and think exactly like us. And that if we were to feel deprived of our favorite hamburger, then we're not going to do this or that. The story is far more complex. There are cultures that are different. There are people who have different values. People who really aspire for things that are not necessarily totally and exclusively material. And that these things are perhaps more important than all the material things. And that this idea that if we impose something, everybody is going to really fall in line. Okay? I mean, my colleague said, well, we don't know really why the Russians and the Chinese have gone with it. I'm a little bit baffled too, but I presume, and I'm going to go on a limb and hazard the guess, they went with it knowing fully ahead of time they're not going to comply with it. And then even if they try to comply with it, they cannot comply with it. They have shared borders. They have shared destiny. What will happen to North Korea will affect China, will affect Russia. It's 10,000 miles away from the United States, but only 10 or 15 miles from China or the borders with Russia. And as long as there is a collective humanity and a collective response and a collective responsibility, they're not going to comply with these. You can't expect them to comply with these. The story is now, these things have been sold to us on the presumption they are non-violent alternatives. Greenstock, who was the representative of the British government in the United Nations, he said, between words and war, there's nothing but sanctions. I beg to differ with that. Sanctions are as violent as war, and has proven to be so. The casualties from these sanctions have been more pervasive and more damaging than much of the wars. In Iraq, the civilian deaths during the war was 123,000, whereas now we're talking about 2.6 million people who had suffered because of the sanctions and the aftermath that came with it. The question is, why can't we entertain other alternatives? Why is it that there is no alternative or anything between war and words? Why isn't dialogue? Why isn't engagement a possible alternative? Why isn't it respect of other countries? We had, to corroborate my colleague's statement, and where is Graham, you were there, we invited the North Korean ambassador here. A group from the labor union called me up. He says, would like the ambassador to come. Could you take us to the faculty club? I said, only if you pay. No. The story is that we brought them in, and the guy came in, and I remember, Graham, you better corroborate this with me. I thought we're going to meet a complete zonkey guy. He's going to come and down with imperialism. We were ready to chant with him. But the story is that he was unbelievably rational. The guy was picking up documents from his briefcase and showing them there wasn't a single American administration that the North Korean did not try to persuade to have a signature on both parties on non-aggression. They're saying we'll dismantle the missile program. We'll dismantle the nuclear program. What we want only from you is a promise and a signature of non-aggression. They never got it. What we have today is a travesty. And what we really have today, and it's amazing, but I'm so proud and really happy to see that you have come, that there are still people, a constituency of conscience, a constituency for peace, a people who believe that we can find alternatives to war and famine and sanctions, and that we can bring this about by working together, by joining our forces and saying enough is enough. Thank you.
Eileen is going to MC the question period, so please. So maybe we can get chairs for them. Maybe Chris and Atif, you want to come up and.
You want us to come sit?
Yeah, we could put you in a. Sure. We got wheeling chairs, so if you're not really doing a good job, we can wheel you out, right?